The story begins with a quiet morning on a film set, but nothing about this day feels normal. The air is heavy. The crew walks with a silent kind of tension, and even the cameras seem to wait for something unspoken. Keanu Reeves steps onto the set with calm eyes, yet inside his mind there is a storm growing. He has worked on many films in his life, but this one feels different. Not because of the script, not because of the location, but because of what is happening behind the camera. Something is breaking, and the world does not know it yet. The film is a large international project, full of pressure, schedules, investors, and headlines waiting to be written. Every hour of delay means a big loss. Every mistake becomes a rumor. Every emotion can become a story for the media. People do not see the work, they only see the result. But Keanu does not judge people that way. He always believed that what happens behind the scenes matters more than what reaches the screen. Sandra Bullock enters the same set a few minutes later. She smiles at the crew, greeting them one by one, the same way she has done all her life. She and Keanu have been friends for many years, ever since the early days when they first worked together. Their friendship was never loud or dramatic. It was built on quiet kindness, real respect, and the ability to understand each other without speaking too many words. They never needed to tell the world what they meant to each other. They simply knew. But today, even Sandra can feel something is wrong. She notices the way people look at the ground instead of each other. She sees the assistant director whispering to a producer with worried eyes. She sees a young crew member standing in the corner holding a notebook with shaking hands. And she knows this is not normal pressure. This is something deeper. Keanu walks over to her, and the moment they stand together, the air feels gentler. They do not need big greetings. A simple nod, a soft smile, and they already understand half the conversation. But today, even their calm nature cannot fix what is happening around them. Before they can even begin rehearsal, the director calls for a meeting. The entire main team gathers in the center of the set. The director speaks with a tight voice. The young crew member who is standing in the corner is suddenly brought forward, and all eyes fall on him. No one knows what is coming, but everyone feels the weight of it. The director says the crew member made a serious mistake the previous night, and because of that mistake, the production lost time and money. The studio is angry. The producers want someone to blame, and right now they want the blame to fall on the young man who is almost too scared to breathe. Some people nod. Some look away. Some stay silent because silence feels safer than truth. But Keanu watches the boy's eyes. Not his mistake. He sees fear, yes, but he also sees exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that does not come from one bad night, but from weeks of carrying more than he can hold. Keanu does not judge yet. He waits. He listens. He observes. The director says something that changes the entire air in the room. He says the studio wants Keanu to make a public statement about the mistake. Not because it is Keanu's fault, but because the world listens to him. If Keanu speaks, the story becomes controlled. The damage becomes smaller. The blame becomes cleaner. Everyone turns to Keanu at once. They expect him to say yes. They expect him to speak for the studio. They expect him to protect the film. But Keanu says nothing. His silence feels louder than any speech. Sandra stands beside him, and she can sense the inner conflict already forming in his heart. She knows Keanu well. He never uses his voice to destroy someone. He never speaks just to protect his image. If he speaks with truth. But truth is complicated today. Truth is not what the studio wants. Truth is not what the media wants. And truth might cost him more than anyone knows. The meeting ends, but the tension does not. The young crew member walks out of the room with eyes that hold the last piece of his hope. Keanu watches him leave, and his heart feels heavier than before. He has seen this pattern before. One mistake, one tired worker, one public judgment, and suddenly a life changes forever. Sandra quietly walks with Keanu to a quiet corner of the set. She does not ask what he is thinking. She simply waits. She knows he needs time, not answers. He looks at her and says in a soft voice, "They want me to speak against him. They think it will fix things." Sandra looks at him with calm truth and says, "They want a quick solution, but quick is not always right." He nods, but the conflict does not fade. The studio needs him. The film depends on him. The crew trusts him. The media will follow whatever he says. Everything is tied to his next move. If he stays silent, they will blame him. If he speaks the way they want, someone innocent will be crushed. Keanu remembers a moment from many years ago. A quiet conversation with Sandra after a long day of filming. Not about fame, not about success, but about people. About how every person we meet is carrying a story we cannot see. About how the world moves too fast to understand slow pain. About how real kindness is not loud, but it changes the direction of a life in silence. That memory returns like a soft echo, but he does not fully remember the words yet. They feel close, but not complete. Something inside him knows he will need those words soon. Very soon. The day continues, but nothing feels normal anymore. Every step he takes, every voice he hears, every decision waiting in front of him keeps pulling him deeper into the turning point he never asked for. The world is about to watch him, judge him, and expect him to choose a side. But Keanu does not choose sides. He chooses people. And that is what will soon change everything. The night arrives. The set goes quiet. Cameras are covered. Lights are turned off. But Keanu stays awake. He sits alone in his trailer, thinking not about fame, not about headlines, but about the young man who might lose everything because of one moment of tiredness. And he knows one thing clearly now. Whatever choice he makes tomorrow will not just affect the film, it will affect a life. And somewhere inside him, the memory of what Sandra once told him is slowly returning. The full meaning is still hidden, but it is coming back. And when it comes, it will decide everything. Something changed the next morning before anyone even spoke a word. The crew moved slower. The air felt heavier. People were polite, but their voices were careful, almost afraid to disturb something fragile. Rumors had already spread. Some said the young crew member was going to be fired. Some said Keanu had already agreed to read the studio statement. Some even said the studio was thinking about replacing people to protect the film. Fear spreads fast on a film set. Faster than truth. Faster than kindness. Keanu arrived early, before most people. Not to act, not to rehearse, but to think. He stood on the soundstage while it was still quiet, surrounded by cameras that were not recording and lights that were not shining. The silence allowed him to hear what noise normally hides. Questions, doubts, choices. He kept remembering the young crew member's face, the way his hands shook, the way he tried to keep his dignity, while the world around him slowly erased it. Keanu did not know his full story yet, but he already felt a responsibility. Not because he was a star, not because he was famous, but because he was human. And the moment someone has the power to defend another, silence becomes a decision. Sandra arrived soon after. She found him standing alone, and she understood without asking anything. She had known Keanu long enough to read the quiet spaces around him. She walked beside him and said gently, "You are thinking about what they want you to say." Keanu nodded. "They want me to follow the script. They want a clean headline." "But your heart does not want a clean headline," Sandra replied, softly but firmly. Keanu sat down on one of the unused props. "If I say nothing, it looks like I do not care. If I say what they want, it looks like I help destroy someone who does not deserve to be destroyed." Sandra nodded. "The world is loud about blame, but quiet about understanding." That sentence stayed in the air like a lesson that was waiting to bloom. Before they could say more, the assistant director walked in and handed Keanu a printed paper. It was the official statement from the studio. Neat, short, cold, and safe. It blamed the crew member for the delay, apologized to investors, and then asked Keanu to read it to the press later that day. The assistant director said in a low voice, "The studio said this will fix everything." Keanu did not move. He just stared at the paper. The words felt wrong, empty, too easy. This paper was not the truth. This paper was protection, and someone else would pay the price for that protection. The assistant director added, "They said you only need to read it. Just read it once and it all goes away." Sandra watched Keanu's face. She could see the battle inside him. Not anger, not fear. Just the weight of choosing between two versions of himself. The one who keeps peace, and the one who keeps justice. He handed the paper back without reading it aloud. "I need time," he said quietly. The director, the producers, the legal team, and the studio executives did not like the idea of time. They wanted answers fast. They wanted control. They wanted a hero they could use and a villain they could blame. Within an hour, Keanu was called into a small private meeting room. The walls were clean. The table was cold. The room was built for business, not truth. 3 studio representatives sat there, along with 1 lawyer, and 1 publicity strategist who kept adjusting her glasses like she was preparing to shape the world with a single headline. One of the studio men spoke first. His voice was confident, almost rehearsed. "Keanu, we respect you. We know you care about people. But this is about the film, about everyone's job, about millions of dollars. If you speak for the studio, you protect the project," the lawyer added. "And if you do not speak, the press will twist the silence into guilt or conflict. That will harm your image." Keanu listened quietly. Then he said, "What about his image?" The room went silent. Keanu continued. "The young crew member, what about the way this will mark his life? What happens after the film ends for him?" The strategist cleared her throat and said, "We understand the emotional angle, but this is business." Keanu leaned forward just a little and said, "Business is made of people, and people are not disposable." No one had an answer prepared for that. They pushed harder. They spoke about contracts, pressure, responsibilities, deadlines, losses. They talked about everything except the truth. And through it all, Keanu did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He simply refused to say something that would destroy someone who was already at the lowest point. The meeting ended with no agreement. The studio was not happy, and as soon as Keanu left the room, someone inside whispered, "He will have to choose eventually." But Sandra was waiting for him outside the door. She did not say, "What happened?" She simply asked, "What do you feel right now?" Keanu took a slow breath. "I feel like they want me to speak for them, but not for what is right." Sandra placed a hand on his arm and said, "Right will cost you more. It always does, but that is why it matters." Her words echoed inside him like the start of a memory that was still forming, something she once said years ago, something quiet, something real. The day continued with rehearsals, but no one truly acted. They spoke lines, but their minds were on the unfolding conflict. The young crew member stayed silent and alone, already treated like a shadow. No one wanted to stand near. People avoid those who are in trouble, not because they are guilty, but because fear is contagious. Halfway through the day, Keanu did something that surprised the entire set. He walked away from the main stage and went straight to find the young man. No cameras were around. No press, no audience, only honesty. The young crew member looked up in shock when Keanu entered the small equipment room where he was organizing wires to stay useful. He stood up quickly, unable to speak. Keanu sat down on a wooden stool, making the moment feel equal. Then he said, "I wanted to hear your side. No judgment, just truth." The young man tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He thought a big star like Keanu would never care to listen. But Keanu waited. Silence was not pressure. It was space for courage to grow. Finally, the young man said, "I made a mistake. Yes, but I was not careless. I have been working 18 hours a day for weeks." No one noticed. "I have been taking care of my sick father at night. I sleep on the floor of my car. I did not tell anyone because I was afraid of losing this job. Yesterday I made one wrong calculation, and now I am not a person anymore. I am just a problem they are trying to erase." His voice broke completely at the end. Not from guilt, from exhaustion, from being unseen. Keanu said nothing at first. He let the truth exist in the air. Then he spoke softly, "You are not a problem. You are a person who needs support, not blame." The young man tried to hide tears. "No one cares about that." Keanu looked at him calmly and said, "I do. And I am not the only one." That moment created a shift, not in the world yet, but in Keanu's heart. The decision was no longer about what the studio wanted. It was about whether he would stay silent while a good person was erased for convenience. He walked back onto the main set where Sandra was waiting. She saw the change in his eyes before he even spoke. She smiled softly and said, "You know what you have to do." Keanu nodded. "Yes, but the world might not like it." Sandra replied, "Truth does not need to be liked. It needs to be lived." And then it happened. The studio announced that a press conference would take place the next day. They expected Keanu to read the statement. They expected him to stand in front of the cameras and say, Everything they had written for him. But Keanu had already made his choice, and the world had no idea what was coming. The next day arrived faster than anyone was ready for. The press conference was scheduled for the afternoon, but the pressure started from morning. Every phone vibrated with alerts. Every crew member whispered half-sentences. The internet was already waiting for drama. The story had spread beyond the film set now. Reporters were outside the studio gates. Fans online were debating. Some defended Keanu. Some expected him to speak for the studio, and some already blamed the unknown crew member without knowing a single real detail. Everyone wanted a headline. No one wanted the truth. Keanu walked into the dressing room, not to prepare his appearance, but to prepare his heart. He did not care about lights, angles, or how he would look on camera. He cared about the weight of the moment. He knew whatever he said would not just affect himself. It would affect the young crew member. It would affect the way the world sees mistakes. It would affect what kind of person he would be when the cameras turn off. He sat on the chair in front of the mirror. The reflection showed a calm face, but behind the eyes there was a storm of thought. He remembered something he once heard long ago. Something about how the hardest part of doing the right thing is that it rarely feels safe. Doing the right thing almost always feels like stepping into fire, not away from it. Sandra walked in quietly and stood behind him. She did not speak right away. She simply placed a cup of tea on the table beside him, the way a real friend does. No advice, no pressure, just presence. After a moment, Sandra said, "Whatever words you choose today, make sure they are your own, not someone else's." Keanu looked at her in the mirror. "I do not want to hurt the film, but I cannot hurt a person to save it." Sandra nodded gently. "Then say what protects both. Truth does not need to attack someone to defend another." Her words opened something in his memory again. Small pieces were returning. A conversation they once had many years earlier during a night shoot. The set had been cold. Everyone was tired. Sandra had said something back then. Not a speech. Not advice. Just one quiet idea about how judgment works. The memory was close now, but still not fully clear. The meaning was forming, but the exact words were not complete. Before they could speak further, someone knocked on the door. It was the head of publicity. She entered without waiting for permission, holding papers like they were weapons disguised as documents. "Keanu, we need to go over the speech one more time," she said in a tone that sounded polite, but felt like pressure. Keanu looked at the paper she was holding. "That is not my speech." The woman paused, confused. "It is the studio-approved statement. This is what you are expected to read." Keanu replied calmly. "I am not expected. I am being asked, and I have the right to decide what I speak." The woman blinked, almost offended. "This is not a personal situation. This is a corporate decision. The film cannot risk bad publicity." Keanu stood up slowly. He was not angry, just clear. A film should not survive by destroying a person who made a human mistake. For a moment, no one spoke. The woman stared, unsure whether he was being noble or dangerous. She finally said, "The studio will not stand behind you if you go off script." Keanu replied, "Then I will stand without them." And that was the moment the power in the room shifted. The woman left, frustrated. Keanu stayed where he was. Sandra looked at him with quiet admiration. She knew most people preach humility and kindness, but only a few live it when it costs something real. The hours passed, and the set slowly transformed into a small press stage. Cameras were placed. Microphones were tested. Studio executives stood together in one corner, whispering with worried faces. A few crew members watched from a distance, scared but curious. They wanted to know if Keanu would really speak the truth, or if he would surrender to pressure like so many others before him. The young crew member stood far away, almost hiding in the shadows. He did not want to be seen. He did not want to create more trouble. He simply waited for his fate to be decided by people with bigger voices than him. Then the moment arrived. Keanu walked onto the small stage. The room went silent in an instant. Flashes began. Cameras focused. The world was watching. Every social platform had live streams. Reporters leaned forward, ready to turn his next words into headlines within seconds. A studio representative stood beside him, holding the printed statement. He placed it on the podium and stepped back as if nothing more needed to be said. Keanu looked at the paper, then looked at the cameras, then at the people behind them, and he did not touch the paper. There was a long silence, a real silence, the kind that does not feel empty, but full of something about to happen. Keanu took a breath and said, "I have been asked to read a statement today, but I cannot read something I do not fully believe." The room froze. A few executives shifted in their seats. The publicist stared, eyes wide, but Keanu continued. "There was a mistake made on this set. That is true. But mistakes do not define a person. Pressure does strange things to people. Exhaustion does even more. Sometimes we judge someone without knowing anything about what they are carrying inside." The room was dead still. His voice remained gentle, not dramatic, but every word felt like a quiet earthquake. He continued, "I was told that speaking against someone would solve the problem, but I do not think blaming a single person is the answer. I do not want to protect a film by destroying a human being. I believe in accountability, but also in compassion." The reporters were frozen. They were not prepared for this kind of speech. They expected anger, defense, scandal. Instead, they were hearing something the world rarely hears in public: kindness spoken with courage. Keanu paused again. Cameras zoomed closer. And then he said something that made Sandra's eyes soften, because she knew he was getting close to the memory that had been calling him back. "Someone once told me that when the world rushes to judge, the most respectful thing you can do is slow down and look deeper." The room waited for him to continue, but before he could, something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the room said, "Keanu, are you defending the crew member who caused the delay?" A reporter had shouted the question, trying to twist the narrative back into drama, but Keanu did not react with anger. He simply answered, "I am defending the idea that a person is more than a mistake." That answer broke the usual script of public statements. It was not rehearsed. It was not legal. It was not safe. It was real, and the world felt it. Then, before ending, Keanu said one more sentence that shook the room in the softest way possible. "A film can recover from a delay. A person cannot always recover from being publicly crushed." He stepped away from the podium without waiting for applause, questions, or praise. The press was still trying to process what they heard. No one had expected him to refuse the official statement. No one had expected him to defend someone without being forced. No one had expected him to make dignity more important than image, and yet he had done exactly that. As he walked off the stage, Sandra was already waiting. She smiled at him with a look that said everything without speaking a word. But not everyone was smiling. At the far end of the room, the studio executives were standing together, whispering with tight expressions. They were not happy. They were not impressed. They were calculating the cost of what had just happened, and behind a column, almost unseen, the young crew member stood with tears slowly building. Not from pain this time, but from disbelief that someone had finally stood for him when the world expected. Silence. The press conference was over, but the real storm was just beginning. Keanu had made a choice, and the world was about to react. The press conference ended, but the silence that followed was louder than the speech itself. Reporters did not move at first. They just stared at each other, confused by what they had witnessed. They came expecting scandal, blame, and drama. Instead, they got a speech that carried no anger, no insult, no accusation, only truth spoken with calm strength. It was not the kind of story they were used to writing. It was too human, too sincere, too hard to twist. But the world outside did not stay silent for long. Within minutes, the internet exploded. People shared clips again and again. Some called it the most respectful speech ever given during a conflict. Others said they had never seen a major star defend a crew member like that. The public was not used to gentleness being used as power. It felt unusual. It felt shocking. It felt real. At the same time, another kind of storm was building, a quiet one behind closed doors. The studio executives gathered in a conference room far from the cameras. The door stayed locked. Voices inside were sharp, rushed, and tense. They did not care about the speech's kindness. They cared about control. They cared about headlines. They cared about money. And Keanu had just broken the script they wanted the world to follow. The head of publicity spoke first. He never read the statement. He rejected everything. Now the narrative is in his hands, not ours. The finance head replied, "If this becomes bigger, investors will panic." Another said, "We trusted him because he never causes trouble. Why did he pick now to act like this?" The room fell into an argument. Some wanted to pressure Keanu again. Some wanted to replace the crew member immediately and continue filming. Some even suggested that if Keanu continued defending the boy, they might need to reconsider his position in the film. Meanwhile, outside the room, crew members whispered in the hallways. Some were shocked by Keanu's boldness. Some were inspired. Some were afraid of what might come next. Even those who stayed silent could feel that something in the set had shifted forever. The young crew member, the one at the center of everything, was sitting alone on a staircase outside the soundstage. He could still hear Keanu's words in his mind. "You are not a problem. You are a person." No one had ever said something like that to him in such a moment. He had been ready to disappear quietly, to accept the blame and walk away without a fight. But now, for the first time, someone had reminded him he had value. He did not cry loudly. He just let one quiet tear fall, not from weakness, but from relief. Even if the world still judged him, even if he lost his job, he would never forget that someone saw him as more than a mistake. While the crew whispered and the studio panicked, Keanu was walking outside the building with Sandra. They did not speak for a while. They just walked slowly, letting the fresh air wash away the tense weight of the cameras. Finally, Sandra looked at him and said, "I am proud of what you did." Keanu smiled slightly. "I just told the truth." "Truth is the rarest thing people say when the world is watching," Sandra replied softly. Keanu stopped for a moment, standing under the shade of a tree. "I know what will happen now. They will be angry. They will say I made things worse. They will try to make me choose again, but I made my choice," Sandra nodded. "You already knew this would not end with the speech." Keanu looked at her with a quiet seriousness. "The real fight starts now." As they spoke, someone walked toward them. It was the young crew member. He looked nervous, unsure if he was even allowed to come close. But Keanu stepped forward and smiled in a gentle way that made it easier. The young man said, "I do not know how to thank you. No one in my life has ever done something like that for me." Keanu shook his head. "You do not owe me thanks. You deserve fairness. That is all." The boy hesitated. "They still might fire me," Keanu replied. "They might. But if they do, they will have to fire me too." The boy's eyes widened. He did not expect that level of protection. To him, Keanu was an untouchable legend. But now he was standing like a shield, choosing people over power. Sandra placed a supportive hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Sometimes the world only changes when someone refuses to stay silent." Before they could speak further, Keanu's phone buzzed. It was a message from the studio, short and cold. "Meeting in 1 hour. Mandatory." Keanu showed the screen to Sandra. She understood what it meant. The studio was preparing to push back, harder than before. The meeting took place in a highly secured conference room. No cameras, no reporters, no witnesses. Only executives, lawyers, and Keanu. They did not waste time with greetings. The head executive spoke first. "Keanu, what you did today put the entire production at risk," another added. "You defied a studio directive." "That is written in your contract," Keanu responded calmly. "I did not defy anything. I spoke in my own words." "That is still allowed in this world, is it not?" The executive leaned forward. "You embarrassed the company," Keanu replied. "I protected a human being. If the company is embarrassed by that, maybe the problem is not my words." The lawyers exchanged looks. They were not used to someone refusing fear. They tried different approaches: pressure, logic, guilt. They told him millions were at stake. They told him sponsors were questioning things. They told him investors were making calls. But none of it changed his position. Finally, the executive raised the real threat. "Keanu, if you continue down this path, we may need to replace the crew member and possibly replace you." The room turned silent. Keanu did not raise his voice. He simply said a sentence that stunned the table. "If you replace him for one mistake, you will need to replace me for being human." Silence again. Heavy, still, undeniable. No one had expected him to put himself on the line. The executive tried one last move. You would walk away from a major film to protect someone who is not even close to your position, Keanu replied. His position is not the point. His humanity is. They had no answer for that. Not because they agreed, but because they had never faced someone who meant what he said without anger, threat, or ego. They ended the meeting without resolution. They needed time to decide their next move, and Keanu left the room with the same calm expression he had entered with. But inside, something had finally clicked into place. As he walked back into the quieter part of the building, Sandra was waiting again, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, expression soft but knowing. She asked, "So what did they say?" Keanu replied, "They think I chose the wrong side." Sandra smiled gently. "You chose the human side. That is the right one, even if it costs more." He nodded slowly, and then, like a quiet spark, the full memory finally returned. Years ago, on a distant film set, when they were both younger, Sandra had said something while sitting on the hood of a car after a long night shoot. It was not recorded. It was not part of an interview. It was just one friend speaking truth to another. Keanu now remembered her exact words, but he did not speak them aloud yet. He closed his eyes. For a moment, the turning point was no longer coming. It had arrived, and what came next would not just test his career. It would test who he truly was when no camera told him what to be. The storm was not finished. It was only beginning. The day after the studio meeting felt different from every day before. Nothing was said aloud, but everyone on set could feel that something was about to break. The executives were silent, the lawyers were invisible, and even the director avoided eye contact. It was the kind of silence that usually comes before a decision that will change everything. Keanu arrived on set early again, not to rehearse, not to act, but to stand in the middle of the place where the story had started and where it would soon reach its turning point. He knew the studio was making its final move. He knew they were deciding whether to fire the young crew member, suspend filming, or even remove him from the project. But he also knew one thing clearly now. No matter what they chose, he would not stay silent again. The young crew member walked up to him slowly. He looked tired but calmer than before. "I heard they are going to make an announcement today," he said softly. Keanu looked at him with steady eyes. "Whatever they announce, you are not alone." The boy nodded, struggling to hold back emotion. "Before all this happened, I used to think people like me were invisible to people like you." Keanu replied, "No one is invisible. Some people just go unseen until someone decides to look." At that moment, Sandra arrived, carrying the same calm strength she always brought into a room. She stood next to them and said, "Whatever happens now, truth already changed something. That cannot be undone." Before they could speak more, the studio sent out a message to the entire set. Mandatory meeting. Main stage. 10 minutes. Everyone gathered. Cameras were off, but eyes were wide. The executives stood in a row holding papers again, but this time, their expressions were different. They were not confident. They were cautious. The head executive stepped forward and said, "After reviewing everything, the studio has decided not to fire the crew member." The room reacted with shock. Not loud, but real. He continued, "We will improve work conditions to prevent overwork and burnout. New guidelines will be added. We will not place public blame on any individual." Keanu did not smile, but his eyes softened. The executive then added one sentence that changed the tone completely. This decision was influenced by the words spoken yesterday. Everyone understood. Keanu had not just protected a person. He had changed the direction of the entire production. The young crew member covered his face for a moment, not to hide tears, but to breathe through a relief he never thought he would feel again. But the biggest shift came when the executive turned toward Keanu and said, "We still wish the official statement had been read, but we respect that you chose differently." It was not an apology, but it was respect. And respect changes more than apology ever could. After the meeting, Keanu stood alone for a moment, not proud, not heroic, just quiet. That was when Sandra walked up beside him and finally said the words he had been remembering piece by piece. When the world tells you to judge fast, slow down instead, she said gently. People are not headlines. Sometimes the one who looks like a problem is the one who needs the most understanding. She smiled, because now she knew he remembered, and he nodded, because now he finally did. The days that followed felt lighter, almost as if a quiet storm had passed and left something cleaner behind. The crew worked with more peace. People smiled at each other again. Conversations that were once filled with worry now carried a new kind of respect. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew the shift began the moment Keanu chose people over pressure. The young crew member stayed on set, not because someone protected him, but because someone believed in him. He worked harder, but this time he was not invisible. The director asked about his ideas. The team asked if he needed help. The same people who once walked past him without noticing now treated him like a real part of the production. The world had not changed, but the small world around him had, and that was enough to change his life. Keanu continued filming as if nothing dramatic had ever happened. He did not brag. He did not take credit. He simply returned to work with the same gentle energy he always carried. But people looked at him differently now, not as a star, not as a legend, but as someone with a real heart that showed up when it mattered. One afternoon, while the cameras were being adjusted, the young crew member approached Keanu again. This time, his voice was steady. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Before all this, I was ready to quit this job. I thought I was not made for this industry. I thought one mistake meant I had no future left. But now I understand something. It is not the mistake that destroys people. It is the silence of others." Keanu listened carefully. The boy continued, "You did not fix everything in my life, but you reminded me I still have a life worth fixing. I will never forget that." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Then make your future strong enough to help someone else one day. That is how kindness stays alive." The boy nodded, and for the first time in weeks he smiled without fear. Later that evening, Sandra and Keanu sat in a quiet corner of the set, watching the sunset through the tall studio windows. They did not speak at first. They just let the soft orange light fill the silence. Finally, Sandra said, "You know, the world will forget the rumors, the pressure, the studio arguments, but they will never forget what you said that day." Keanu shook his head slowly. "They will not remember me. They will remember the feeling." "That is enough," Sandra smiled. "Maybe, but I think the feeling had your voice." They shared a soft laugh, the kind that belongs only to people who have carried weight together and walked through it without losing who they are. As the film neared completion, something unexpected happened. The young crew member, the one who almost disappeared, was offered a chance to work in another department, one that suited his real talent. Someone had noticed his skill in visual planning and recommended him for assistant storyboard artist. It was a small title but a big step, the kind that builds a career, the kind that never would have happened if he had been fired that week. On the final shooting day, he approached Keanu and Sandra one last time. He held a small notebook, the same one he always carried, but now it was not shaking in his hands. "I want to say goodbye," he said softly, "and thank you. Not for saving me, but for seeing me," Keanu replied. "I did not save you. You were already worth saving," Sandra added. "And now it is your turn to pass that forward." He nodded deeply and left with a future he never expected to have. Weeks later, the press finally found out what had happened on set. Not because Keanu told them, not because the studio leaked it, but because one journalist decided to report the truth instead of the gossip. The article spread across social media, not as a scandal, but as a lesson. One sentence from it went viral. He did not defend a mistake. He defended a person. Even people who never knew the full story shared it. Because kindness is always more powerful when it looks gentle, not loud. Months passed. The film released. It became a success. But the real success did not appear in box office numbers, interviews, or award shows. It appeared in a small moment during a public event when a reporter asked Sandra about Keanu's speech, thinking it was just another question for headlines. She smiled kindly and said, "People always talk about what Keanu does. They forget who he is. He does not choose kindness for attention. He chooses it because it is the only thing in this world that never loses value. The reporter asked, "Was that line he said really inspired by you?" Sandra nodded gently. "Yes, but he did not remember my words. He lived them." That answer stayed in the hearts of everyone who heard it. Years later, when someone asked the young crew member about the turning point of his life, he said something simple but unforgettable. "It was the day someone refused to step on me just to stay standing." Taller, and that one sentence carried the true ending of the story. Kindness did not just save a moment, it created a chain, and it kept moving forward. Because kindness is not loud, but it never ends where it starts.